And I want you to get this because it's a bombshell. Tell your neighbor, wake up, this is a bombshell. The Greek word fornication in the Bible does not refer to premarital sex. See, when the Apostle Paul says flee fornication in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he is not saying flee sex outside of marriage. The word translated fornication in the Bible is the Greek word porneia. It appears about 24 times in the New Testament, and the root word for the word porneia is the Greek word pornos, which means a harlot or a prostitute. Y'all following me?
Already wrong. You know what I mean? Like, already incorrect. He said the root word for porneia is pornos, and it always means prostitute. False. You see, what this man does not want is his church to like fact check him. Like, you know what I mean? He doesn't want his church to read the Bible. I mean, that's clear to me. And it's interesting because he wants to start at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. But if you just turn the page back to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and you try to limit the word pornos to prostitutes only, well, then the language falls apart completely. Watch this. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with bedroom immoral people. You know what I'm doing here? Not at all meaning the bedroom immoral of this world, or the greedy and the swindlers or the idolaters, since you would need to go out of the world, right? So think about what Paul is saying here. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with pornoi, right? So it's the plural of pornos there. Not at all meaning the pornoi of this world, which, by the way, so to associate here, look at that in verse 9. It means to mix closely. You know what I mean? Like, so this is like close fellowship. I mean, that's what Paul is concerned about in the church. It's this idea of being close together with folks who are pornoi, right? Well, that's interesting. So if this man is correct on stage and pornoi means prostitutes, then Paul is apparently trying to fix a rampant problem of Christian prostitutes within the Corinthian church. Too many of the Corinthian Christians have decided to mix closely and fellowship with prostitutes who have somehow made their way into the church. And they're apparently making themselves known as prostitutes. So Paul says, don't associate with these Christian prostitutes. But then look at that. He also says, well, go ahead and mix yourselves closely with the prostitutes of the world, though, because that's totally fine. I just don't want you to mix closely with prostitutes when they claim to be Christian. But if they're upfront about their prostitution, go ahead and fellowship with them. Huh? Again, I mean, this just makes absolutely no sense. So, I mean, like, think about it this way, too. Like, that's what I mean. Like, what do you have to do to bend backwards into exegetical pretzels just to get to what this man on stage wants to claim? In Greco-Roman culture, and think about this. So Corinth was a blend of both Greek and Roman influence. You know, initially established as a Greek city, taken over by the Romans later, right? And so you have both of these influences there at the time that Paul is writing. In this particular culture, prostitution was highly stigmatized. You know, you can take a look, by the way, at like the writings of Seneca or Juvenal, right? Who wrote about this kind of a thing. Disguises and secrecy were necessary for prostitutes to avoid disgrace. And by the way, that's in pagan culture. In the Jewish culture, which you got to think for a moment, the early church emerged out of the Jewish culture. Prostitution was even more stigmatized than in the pagan world. So whoever would perform these acts of prostitution, they would do so in secret, right? There's stories of this. So if you go to Genesis chapter 38, I mean, this is clear. The story of Tamar in Genesis 38, it's a perfect example of this. She's trying to get pregnant. You remember this? So what does she do? She puts a veil over her face and pretends to be a prostitute. Now think about this. If pornos means prostitutes, then Paul is somehow, he's attributing some kind of magical powers to Christians who can just automatically identify all the secret prostitutes in their area so that they can go fellowship and break bread with them. Come on, guys. This is ridiculous. And this man is trying to do some exegetical backflips so that he can excuse sin.
Context of verse 18 begins in verse 13 of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul says the body is not meant for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Should I therefore take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Do you not know that whatever is united to a prostitute becomes one body with her? Then Paul says in verse 18 to flee fornication. So the entire context of verse 18, church, is about fleeing prostitution.
Swing and a miss again. So a couple things here. Okay. By the way, look at the verse for reference. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 13. The body is not meant for bedroom immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Now let me stop right here. Okay. Again, this makes no sense if Paul is talking about prostitution. Why? Well, because that means that Paul is saying that the human body is not meant to go to bed for money. That's the qualification, for money. But it somehow is meant to go to bed with lots of people outside of marriage, guys, because that's totally fine. Do you see what I mean? Like, what's the difference, really? What would be the meaningful distinction between having multiple partners and getting paid for it and having multiple partners and not getting paid for it? You see how none of this makes any sense? What Paul is saying is, here, your body is meant for one person, your spouse. How do I know that? Well, because Paul literally says this. Watch this. Verse 16. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. Wait a second. Where is Paul quoting from right there at the very end? He's quoting from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Guess what Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 is about? Yep, you guessed it, marriage. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So in other words, Paul is saying, do not violate your bodies with anybody who is not your spouse. Period. You were designed by God. And it's given to us, like right in the creation account, to give your body to one person for life. In the same way, you were designed by God to give yourself to only one God, the God of all creation. So you see the parallel, like marriage. This is why I say marriage speaks theology, right? Anything outside of this dynamic in marriage is porneia. That's why Paul contrasts marriage to porneia. And prostitution is certainly one form of porneia, but there are other forms that fit into the broader category of stepping outside the bounds of marriage in the bedroom. You know? And you know this by being a careful reader of Scripture.